Hi, everyone. Welcome to I Love Myself Fix podcast, Coming into Grace, hosted by mother and son duo, Osh and Courtney. Courtney Fix and at Osh's Fix. Today, we're joined by George Walker. How are you today, George?
I'm good, thank you.
It's really nice to see you. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'm honored and humbled to be invited.
It's on you. You go.
Okay. May I ask you what you do in life? What is your occupation?
Sure. So, of course, there's the quick answer is I'm the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for a national nonprofit. Um, I think what I do is actually to be intentional about helping organizations create a culture that values all of its employees, irrespective of their background, where they come from, in a way that they can truly bring their full self to work and show up, and not just authentically, in quotes, because that's what we say we're supposed to be saying now, but truly, what does it mean to get the best out of employees and have them lead with their experience, their expertise, and their cultural competency? And it's not just about their experience as a diverse candidate, check the box.
That's actually wonderful. Thank you.
I'm going to turn off that phone. I am going to ask only for the audience, what leads one to that type of job? And you don't have to go give your whole,
Career trajectory. No, I think it's an impulse. I knew that this is the work I wanted to do before I knew it had a title. When I look back at my history and sort of how I grew up, where I grew up, who I am, it was always something that felt natural to me. To be outspoken on issues of social justice, to think critically about what it means to bring people in. That was an impulse. It was an impulse. I'm also an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, and one of the things, even in that denomination, it had been historically an open denomination. And when I was seeking ordination, it was clear to me that I was already a member of the Congregational UCC Church, but I knew that there was the reason I wanted to do the work I ultimately ended up getting paid to do was because even as I thought about my journey within church work, it was always focused on what does social justice look like. The sermons that appealed to me most were about inclusion and messages that talked about the least of these and what that really means. And that was usually in a context of an educated, middle-class, Black church experience. And yet I still think we had a lot to say about what we did for the least of these. Because even for people who have been disenfranchised in many ways, there's still hierarchy. There's still opportunities that some of us get and others don't. I'd been raised on the value to whom much is given, much is required, and even that much is more is expected. That was an impetus for me. And I think that it just turned that my life, when I look back on it and look at some of the different experiences I've had, it was setting me up to do the work that I currently do. And when I talk to other people who do diversity and inclusion work, diversity, equity, and inclusion has a couple of different names, people work, they say similar things about a natural draw that they identified very, very young in life. And this is a relatively new field, so I think in part, people are still adjusting to, now you can get a certificate around diversity and inclusion, or you can go to school and there's certainly more conversations. In the times we live in, particularly over the last couple of weeks, my phone has, not so much my phone has rang off the hook, but I certainly have gotten more text messages, more invitations to talk, conversations about what diversity looks like. How do we do it better? How do we do it, And a lot of how I can answer now is because I've been in this work for now 7 years professionally. But prior to that, all the other jobs I had some aspect of me being the person who was leading around an issue, whether it was in fundraising, creating more space for people of color at the fundraising table, or within LGBT organizing. It was making sure that the voices of people, Black people or people of color, Indigenous people, those voices were actually included in a larger framework on why marriage equality, for instance, would be important. So it was all of those kinds of things that were the tiny pricks that said, okay, this is your career trajectory. This is where you're going. Yeah, and that's kind of where I think, and I suspect that many people would have a similar story.
Mm-hmm. It, not now, just in a kind of similar way as for me. I mean, my background's food, and I've done all these other things. But the thing that speaks to me the most is the heart of people and emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And it was funny, and although that, that was developed 20, 30 years ago, but the term has just been recently been being used. And so,
Right.
I would find myself in certain situations always trying to massage the person along, or trying to change the lens, or to try to do all these different things. And then I remember being sad. I was like, I'm not really ever going to get paid for this. Like, this is never, like I said, this is just what's in my heart. And then probably just, like a few years ago, I kept seeing it, and then I just kept reading more about it. But in that very similar way, I said, oh, this is exactly who I am. This isn't what I am, what I'm certified in. This is who I live, this is what I live by.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's beautiful to hear you say that. And even in this process with these interviews, for me, it's the touch points, and to see it naturally be in him. Like when we talked about this project, it's how can we touch people and be touched and hear what it is that lights them up, that they feel good about. So that's beautiful that you share that journey.
Thank you. I think that one of the things I would just add to that is I am also trained as a certified coach, and I remember one of our professors saying, human nature, we are meaning-making machines. Our existence is always to make meaning. So we're making meaning constantly. And in that, we're also making stories. Mm-hmm. And I had a colleague say recently in a meeting, she said, we spend a lot of time talking about, listen to the voiceless. The truth is, it's not that people don't have voices. Mm-hmm. It's that we don't listen to their voice.
Correct.
Or different voices get greater weight. And I think, likewise, as meaning-making people, we all have stories. Mm-hmm. And it is now becoming more clear that each of us has a story to tell, and our ability and our impetus, our own, and I want to say the thing that animates us mm-hmm. is our ability to tell our story in our voice mm-hmm. and the way we want to do it. And I will say that as someone who's, in the space of culture change and trying to make a difference, my own growth edges are usually when I realize that I've started to write someone else's story, or you meet someone and you say, okay, I know how this is going. Mm-hmm. And you've already come to a conclusion.
Correct.
And you haven't listened to, well, there might be more information here. Mm-hmm. Or there may be something that's different in their story. And I mean, I've had several of those moments. And in fact, just today, I remember I got an email from someone that I have a story about. And I wanted to respond in a certain way that was very practical and that would flow practically out to be able to check the box and say, I responded to you. But when I paused for a second and realized, well, her story isn't going to be my story. And what she needed for information from me as a professional in this particular context might help her story to be reshaped in a way that will be appropriate for her, not in the way that I decide she needs to learn or she needs to grow. Because my mother told me years ago before she died, I will never forget it. I'd been home at Christmas and I'd shared with my parents that I was gay. I was living with my first boyfriend at the time, the first one I was living with. And I remember after I left, it was a wonderful Christmas and a great time with both my parents. And I remember my mother wrote me a letter, and she wished me Happy New Year, said she enjoyed our visit. And she ended it by saying, I've always been proud of you. And one of the reasons I'm proud of you is because you've always been able to say what makes you happy. You told me you're happy. Your happiness doesn't have to be mine. I get to be happy in the way that makes sense for me. And that's all I ever want for you. And she went on to say a few other things, but that for me was one of the most, and I've kept that letter. I know exactly where it is. Well, I don't write specifically today, just because our house is a mess. But I know kind of where I can put my hand on it. And I use it as a touchstone because it mattered so much to me that what my mother said to me was, you tell your story your way, and it's okay. Your story does not have to be mine. And I think the more we can listen to other people's stories and understand and appreciate that, your truth is yours. It doesn't have to be my truth. I think the difficulty is when we say that's what we want to do, but in fact, we operate in different ways. And so my work is really about making sure that if we say that we want people to show up authentically, are we truly creating space for them within our organization that allows for that possibility to be true? So I can't tell you, you can work from home, but then I'm judging you about the fact that you're working from home. And until this pandemic comes through, everybody suddenly realized, oh, guess what? People can work from home. And they've been telling us they wanted to do that for a long time. We can listen to a new model and we can hear a new story.
You have a question?
I would just want to ask you, it seems that things that you enjoy have ushered you towards this line of work. Would you say that your gifts and your true talents and what you were brought here to this earth contributes to that? Contributes to what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I would absolutely say that. Yes, I would. I mean, I feel like I'm old enough now to have had a few different jobs and different experiences. I am the most clear now than I've ever been about what my work is and what my calling is. And I was always I was pretty successful. I went to college, I went to graduate school and, did a bunch of fellowships and, on paper, I think a lot of things were lining up with the stuff that I thought I was good at. When I came into this work, it was so clear that this was my path. And what I've said to people all the time, who knows? I may expand and do something else at a different time. I suspect that at some point I'll want to do the work I do in a different organization. I'm certainly not a career jumper. Like I don't go from job to job, but I even have a very different view of that. But what I know is that I want to continue to take this philosophy about how I show up and encourage others to do the same to their work. I lead with that. And I think that when you're most authentic, the people around you, whether they're your subordinates or your supervisors, will see it, and they will also want to touch. People want to be with authentic people.
Mm.
And, you know, if someone's feeding you a line, you know that you may not know exactly what the line is, but usually you know when it's when it's not true. You know, the sort of the what is it? The scales come off.
Right.
You know, I think that, you know, it's not because there aren't fake people out, and there aren't people who, you know, strive really hard to create an image for what they want to portend to be. But that's usually not in this kind of space, just because it takes so much emotional energy. And if you don't have a well to be able to go to and to draw and fill back up your cup, you know, you just won't last very long, and people will know it. So yeah.
I would just like to ask you, as a man of color, what was the hardest thing for you to deal with or learn from as a child?
Let me hear the last expression.
As a child or a young?
As a child, yeah. So, that's an interesting question, and I'll give you a little bit more context. My parents were very clear about who I was as a young Black boy, because that's like, in their head, that was kind of like, as identity, that's just who we were. You know, we were in the South. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. There wasn't a lot of confusion, even, you know, as I had opportunities to integrate different things. My parents were really clear that it was like, and it wasn't even, and I think that, you know, people get different messages, but I probably got a message about what my brilliance was and what I was worth, and the touch on my life. Not just because my parents said it, but other people around me said it, other folks said it. There was just a lot of affirmation in my life. And I think the one other unique piece of my story is I'm adopted. So I was born in the Republic of Panama, and that was never really even a thing for my family. I mean, we didn't talk about it. It wasn't a big deal. Both of my parents are now deceased. I've often thought, well, you know, well, you know, how did that factor in my growing up? And I have friends who are now adopting kids. In fact, several close friends, close friends, have adopted. And they will often ask me, well, you know, how was it for you? You know, when should we be ready to tell our kid, you know, when he or she has questions? And I always, you know, I'm a little reticent about that, because I say, well, I really didn't grow up with that as a context. But that's probably not accurate. I think it was absolutely a context that I was chosen. And my parents, in their choosing, really understood that as a blessing from God. We were a religious family. We weren't a holier than thou family. I mean, my parents went to Sunday. I mean, they were both Sunday school teachers, and, you know, I grew up in the church. But I suspect that I'm probably being a little bit more precise, because I think sometimes we use that as common language, but people have had different experiences in the church. And a lot of my experience in the church, even where I grew up, was about, I remember one of my, a former professor at Howard, who was a member of my church in Memphis. And there were two teachers. They literally checked our essays before we applied to college. Like, we were not talking about whatever the scripture lesson was of the day.
Right.
It was literally, what applications are you making?
Right.
Let me see your essays. You know, even if your parents were able to look at them or what have you. You know, what are you putting in? And you are, of course, looking at HBCUs. And we had like literally, I practiced as a high school senior standing up, I had a couple of acceptances and a couple of different scholarships. And unfortunately, my chosen my chosen school, I didn't get a scholarship to. But we literally would practice, at least I would practice saying, hello, my name is, I am a 19 blah, 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 blah graduate of, and in the fall, I will be attending. And I practiced how it sounded.
Oh, wow.
And I will be attending Morehouse College,
Yeah.
or, you know, some of the other schools that I've been accepted to or gotten a scholarship to. And I literally, that was an expectation that you could say that with confidence. So to your question, I mean, that was my context. I recently was sharing with a friend of mine's son who's about to go to college, and he's going to where I went to Duke for divinity school, and he's about to go to Duke as an undergrad. You know, and he comes from a rich tradition, really strong parents, grandparents, great grandparents. You know, and I was invited by his parents in our Zoom meeting with the family and friends to say something about the Duke experience. And coincidentally, someone spoke just ahead of me who had gone to his mother's college and then gone to Duke. And this guy who's a physician, he was talking, and two things came up really quickly that just sort of built on or gave me an opportunity to say something to the conversation. And one of the things he said was that don't let anyone suggest to you that you are lucky to be at Duke. Duke is lucky to have you.
Right.
Be really clear that what you bring, who you are, how you show up, they are lucky to get that. He's a great baseball talent. He's a pitcher. You know, he went to a really, really amazing school in New York. You know, this is a kid who's just had a lot of good stuff around him. And he's just a lovely, lovely, lovely human being. So that was the first thing they said. But then the second thing they said was, you know, the guy, I had not met him before, mentioned that we're in the same fraternity. We're both alphas. And so my promise to this kid was, if you go, you know, I was excited, of course, he was going to Duke, but I also said, man, if you pledge my fraternity, I'll pay for it. This is another investment I'll make in you going. And there's some history there. So, you know, I think that I was working with fertile ground. And when I talked to him, I said, let me tell you a story of something Sam Proctor, who was the former pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church. And Sam was also a head of Peace Corps in Kenya. And one of the first classes under Kennedy, Sam Proctor did that. And so Sam had been my mentor. I also went to the Peace Corps. I served in Ecuador in South America. And he tells this beautiful story about how there was an occasion when Duke said that one of the Duke family trustees had said, before a Black man preaches, because there was no chance, of course, in this man's imagination that a woman could be the preacher, but before a Black man preaches in Duke Chapel, it will be over my dead body. Quite literally, when Sam Proctor preached at Duke Chapel, he was the first Black man to preach at Duke, and it was literally over the entombment of where this man who had said, it will be over my dead body. So he was correct. And so Sam just, you know, he's just an amazing, powerful, wonderful storyteller. And I was so excited to like be able to just sit with him. And I mean, I can tell you all kinds of stories, but there are a couple that are really impressive about our relationship. But the first was, I had the opportunity to preach at Duke, and I was the first preacher my last year there for the semester. And he came and asked with a sheet of note paper. He said, "Write your parents' address on this paper for me." And I was like, "Okay." And so I'm writing my address. And he said, "I just want to send them a letter." And he literally sent my parents a letter. Now, at that point, I had finished college. I was another stage of my life, blown away. Fast forward to the next semester, my grandmother and my great aunt came up to visit me in North Carolina. And so I took them to class. And so they had classes with a couple of my professors, and he was one of them. And he came to me and he said, you know, George, you have an incubator. And he said, now tell me what an incubator is, because that's what he would ask you. You know, you have to tell him. I was like, well, an incubator, they usually keep babies in it. It puts air around the body. It keeps you, keeps your temperature right, keeps your breathing right until you can do it by yourself. He goes, okay, you know what an incubator is. That's what you had. And you just shared a part of your incubator when you shared your grandmother and your great aunt. So when I was talking to this young guy who's about to be a freshman at Duke, I said, remember why you have an incubator. And so for me, I've always had that chosen space in knowing that that God was around my life, and that I had people who were in my life who were really clear about my possibility, even before I could name all the ways that my possibility was going to show up. I never had to doubt that who I am and how I was going to show up in the world would be questioned, because I already had an incubator. Now, have I had doubts? Of course. Have I felt like, did I, I think we all have demons of that internal voice that says you're not good enough, you're not doing this, you're not that. But it was really, my parents made it just really, really fundamental that voice would never be bigger than the voice that they had, even to things that they didn't know. My mother went to college, but my father didn't. He was a military guy. He'd served and retired from the Air Force and did other things, but he was really, really sharp. And he's like, okay, I may not know how to tell you how to get here, but I know people will be able to tell you that. And funny story is that, even in pledging, when I was in college, I remember it was my father's, two of his closest friends, one was a judge and the other was a teacher. And the teacher, who was actually a principal, lost his job because he stood up for teachers during the Civil Rights Movement. And those are the unsung heroes. I mean, there are plenty of Black people who like to claim they were next to Martin Luther King today, but at the time, that's not true. And he was one of those people who actually was fighting for justice, and it cost him his job. But the judge was another friend of my father's. And now these were his high school buddies and his neighborhood people, because that's the way communities used to do. And you didn't lose touch with people because you went off to college. They were still your friends, and no matter what your experiences were. But both of those men were alphas. And I didn't, I didn't know that like as a college student. Well, actually, that's not true. I think I did know it once I got to college, because then they said, hey, what fraternity are you thinking about? But growing up, that wasn't the first touch point. So I feel like I'm talking a lot.
No, you are, but it's, as you were talking, they have all these styles of the way that you should interview someone. And, some people have interview styles and they keep jumping in but the real purpose of these interviews for us is you.
Right.
It
It
isn't for me to keep trying to, grandize myself to get in there and touch.
Right.
So we're loving, and we're subliminally asking you questions and you're just answering them, George. So it's working.
We're able to learn so much about you through this.
Good. Thank you.
It's very easy interview. Very easy.
I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing, how has the pandemic been for you? How has the shelter in place been for you energetically and spiritually?
It's a funny story. So the first immediate hit of the pandemic. So when it first started, we started getting murmurs that something was really about to start happening. I actually was in California with very close friends, but I was there for a conference. So this is in mid-March. And, I started just being a little bit more circumspect, but wasn't quite nervous about it because I didn't quite know, like most of us, what was coming next. And then I did start paying attention because, of course, New York was an epicenter, but DC also. My headquarters for my organization is actually in New York. I'm very often going to New York until this time, literally June 19th, which I think is the biggest irony. But June 19th of 19, we sold our apartment in New York.
On June
So
9th.
I've been in New York for we had the apartment for 4 or 5 years, but it was literally, we were signing the contract, and I remember looking up and thinking, wow, this is an interesting moment. That, I think I even said something to our buyers. I was like, I am selling a piece of real estate in Manhattan on June 19th to this lovely young white couple. And, fast forward, I think I have been thinking about like the different iterations of how this pandemic has sort of hit. We ended up starting a renovation that actually had started well before that, but literally our contractor was saying, hey, we're going to begin on April 1st. And I was kind of like, is this going to move? What's going to happen? We were very fortunate. We had close friends we could stay with for a couple of weeks, and other friends who were, they have a second home outside the city. They were like, we're out. So we got a house. If you need to, and these are really close friends. So we were fortunate. We haven't been inconvenienced, and I throw that in quotes. And recognizing just how much gratitude we have. I've been so grateful that for the most part, particularly during this part, our life hasn't been destabilized in that way. And of course, for the work I do, my life hasn't been destabilized in terms of the pandemic exactly, but it has had everything to do with everything else that's happened that's meant the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion has been highlighted. It's made me have a lot more work. So those kinds of things are, that's just been sort of and I try to go into most things with gratitude and optimism, and I feel like that's what has taken me through that part emotionally. Though certainly I've had my moments, and we can talk more about some of the other stuff. But the other piece was, I think I got really serious that the pandemic was real because 2 of the first people who died in a public way, at least in my life, but certainly to a lot of people, were people I had a direct connection to. So one was the playwright Terrence McNally, who wrote Love, Valor, and Compassion, and Mother to Son, and a whole bunch of other plays. We weren't close at all, but I had the opportunity to do his wedding. Ironically, he got married on April 5th. I want to say, was this his 10-year? No, 10. We're 20. Yes, so it would have been his 10-year wedding anniversary on April 5th. And he died on March 31st. And, there was just a whole bunch of different nuances, and we'd stayed in touch with each other more with his husband. But that was like, whoa. So the whole thing about, Black people can't, get coronavirus, which I don't know how that even began. And Terrence McNally was white. I kind of was like, okay, that sounds crazy to me, because literally I was seeing what was happening in the arts community, because the next day, David Driscoll died. And David Driscoll is famous for lots of different reasons, but as an artist, he and his wife were just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people. But he was big in helping the National Museum of African American History and Culture come to be. He actually curated Bill and Camille Cosby's personal art collection. So at one time, I don't know if this is still true, that was the largest privately held African American art collection in the world. And David was the curator of that. He also was they named the School of Art at University of Maryland for him. And he was a member of my church.
Mm.
And was just the sweetest man. And I had several opportunities to be with him in New York. He just had led a big panel at the Brooklyn Museum of Art on the souls of Black folks, which is a really big, it was a traveling exposition that was just incredible. If you get a chance to look at it, you absolutely should. Just a profound, lovely man. And to meet him, you would know nothing about how famous he was or who he'd been around or any of those things. And he was an humble guy and a very accessible guy. And so I had both of them, and I'd actually planned to host him for dinner in the fall. That was the other part that just was like a reminder that tomorrow's not promised. And if you think you want to host or be with someone, make it happen. Mm-hmm. So do you, Courtney, and food and bringing in, the food thing. I mean, that's something I'm nobody's real chef, but I enjoy cooking, and I can at least put down a meal that's good enough to have people over for. So we get to do that. But that kind of emotional reminder of what this pandemic has meant, and then seeing the health disparities, of course, and all the different things that have come up, has had its own emotional packaging. Lead that up to this moment of the last couple of weeks in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we can separate that part of why Black people are, and people of conscience, I mean, frankly, everybody is so like, we can have a different moment.
Yes. Yes.
Has everything to do with the fact that Black folks have seen these two pandemics hit each other, but break open new possibilities.
Absolutely. I mean, so, an eruption on top of another. Yeah. If the pandemic was not existing, everyone would still be in a different level of myopia. Mm-hmm. And George, it just would have been another blip, chances are.
Yeah.
But this whole social media space has now turned into its own petri dish in a different way. Mm-hmm. And so now, and everybody's prickled. So then it's like, it's like throwing bigger rocks in a pond. And so as it reverberates, you have to, even for the people who seem to not be paying attention, they are feeling it energetically. Yeah. They're maybe deciding to put up a wall, but I know for sure that they are feeling it.
Well, I think that one of the biggest things, and I've said this, and I don't know that I've seen it written a lot about, but I do think that there is a really curious intersection. And for many people, so George Floyd, if you looked at the chronology of it, George Floyd actually was killed on a Monday. Mm-hmm. We probably didn't really start hearing about it until late Tuesday or Wednesday.
Yes.
So from Monday, Tuesday was the Amy Cooper incident in Central Park.
Central Park, right.
And there's a couple other strands I could pull out about this, but I think one of the things that was really interesting for most people is Black people had been saying, look, not only is there this pandemic that's killing us in terms of health, we know that we are targeted. But for the most part, Black people were saying it to other Black people, or Black and brown people, or, correct, a few good sports who would listen. Mm-hmm. We had on tape where her face was in the frame, weaponizing whiteness,
right,
and what she thought making victim of Blackness, and precisely Black maleness.
Correct.
In a way that many of these things were then turned on their heads on several threads. Mm-hmm. So first, her victim not only was a Black man who was aware of the fact that he needed to take care of himself, and a new way of protecting yourself is to tape it.
Mm-hmm.
He also is gay.
Mm-hmm.
So the trope about a Black man wanting some white woman in the park was out the door because he was openly gay.
Right.
Correct.
And I think in one of the pictures afterwards, I mean, he had on a Pride t-shirt.
Yeah.
So none of the sexual, I mean, not with smart people, right? Or not even very smart people. None of the sort of sexual innuendo about why he might have been telling her to constrain her dog was left on the table. It was clear that what she said and how she said it, she made it open for everybody, and she was a liberal, in quotes.
Yeah.
So then you go back to saying, this is what happened. And for a lot of people, they needed to hear that he went to Harvard and he was a PhD and
Absolutely.
he did all the other sort of things. But Black America and anybody who had a wit of a brain was clear that no, these two things aren't separated. You're not going to make him the exception because guess what? We already have George Floyd on film too.
Mm-hmm.
So then we could also look at Breonna Taylor. We could also look at Tony, oh gosh, I just blanked on his name, the transgender man in Florida who was killed in police custody. You know, any number of other people who like, it was almost like bop, 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 right there.
I mean, and even they had the footage with Ahmaud Arbery. They had the incidental footage of him. He just kept coming and visiting the house. Like,
yeah.
you know, I would think about Osh and the stuff that he does. Like, you know, and that is its own form of education. So in my mind, when I saw the little cam of him, you know, and he's going to visit a house that's being renovated.
Yeah.
You know, that to me, I was like, that's an excursion. Like,
yeah.
you know, I imagine him being in there and creating a new world for those moments. But
right.
But it just, you know, it's almost like you know, it's almost like, you know, everything to me always turns into food, but it's almost like, you know, like that 10-layer carrot cake. And it's like, they just kept getting stacked and stacked and stacked so that it just kept pushing. So that by the time the door opened, there were too many stacks behind it with no time for anyone to get any air to forget about it.
Yeah.
It's a perfect storm.
Yeah. Yeah. Literally, I don't know if you were listening to Oprah Winfrey last night and the talk with different leaders. It was part 2 of this conversation she had on where do we go from here. And I won't completely spoil the ending only because the person who said it is just so amazing that he always has the perfect thing to say. William Barber, Reverend William Barber from North Carolina. And he has this great line about what breath means and what it means to take in new breath and what it means to have said, I can't breathe, but I can breathe. So for those of us who can breathe, what does that new breath look like? What will we be taking in? And, you know, certainly we'll be taking in, you know, the breath of the ancestors. But we'll be breathing out something that is new and evocative and fresh, if we choose to.
Right.
And I think the question is always, you know, the Star Spangled Banner ends, oh, say does that Star Spangled Banner yet wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. And is one of the few, I think actually it's the only national anthem that ends in a question mark. So does it? And I think that America actually has to ask itself, is this true? And I think that there will be many people who say it is true, and here's how we're going to make changes to make it true. But there are an awful lot of people for whom pushing back on that truth is, I mean, it literally will change so much about how they have structured their life and their world. And, you know, power doesn't give up easily.
weren't we?
So,
We were just talking about, that very thing. And as someone was saying to me, it was like, this is the point and it has to work out. And, and I gave, and it's beautiful for the way that you set it up, because now I can give this analogy and no one could take it personally. But, when you look at animals, which we're animals,
Exactly.
and there are no animals, but if that lay down, they don't lay down. So if there's always an alpha in almost every form of, some species of animals.
Mhm.
And there are only but some that will sit there and say, I'm willing to lay back. You'll see an elephant lay back to then thus feed and be willing to, wait for its child, but there are not many animals that will give up their power.
mm-hmm.
In this case, it is uncomfortable. It is a brain rewiring, and it is a higher vibration to decide that
Mm-hmm.
I am available to take less, because you're never taking less, but you have to decide to take less to get that. There's always enough and everyone gets more.
Mhm.
Right.
But,
Right.
but
Takes so long to take that last.
Hey,
No.
what did you say? I'm sorry, Ash.
That it takes so long to just realize that you're just giving to get that room.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right.
this is like a natural ending. So one of the things that we ask everyone on the show is if they would look in the camera and say, I love myself.
I love myself.
Yes, you do, George Walker. We love you too.
Thank you very much. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you for this conversation.
Oh,
thank you.
Thank you more
Very
than you know.
Yes.
What about you, Ash?
I love myself.
I love myself too.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for watching.
Bye-bye now.
All right. And tune in next time for Coming into Grace, knowing who we are and loving ourselves for. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, George.
Bye, George.
Bye-bye.